right, hello everybody. Thanks a lot for coming to today's OWL's meeting. We're extremely pleased to welcome Ugo Dal Lago from the University of Bologna, who will talk to us about differential program semantics. Over to you, Ugo.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for the introduction. I hope you can all hear me well. This is going to be about differential program semantics indeed. Let's start from some motivation about program semantics per se. So whenever you have a modern software system made of many interacting components, sometimes you would like to single out one of these components and to throw it away and replace it with another component. But you would like to do it only if you know that A can be replaced with B, so that, in other words, A and B are equivalent, or at least B is a refinement of A. And this happens all the time when, for example, you do compiler optimization, but if you take A as a specification and B as an implementation, this is even a form of program verification itself. And program semantics is interesting because it gives you ways to define a program equivalence and define the meaning of programs in such a way that A can be dubbed equivalent to B and can be replaced with it. Okay. So
Ugo,
let me.
Ugo, sorry to interrupt you. There's actually a little bit of interference in the quality of your sound.
Oh,
there before.
I'm so sorry.
Where's your microphone? Is it on your headset or something? Could you maybe?
I think it's here on the cam. It should be good. Maybe. Can you hear better like that?
It sounds quite similar. I mean, it's okay. So if it's a big problem to fix, then that's okay. But
yeah, okay. Maybe I can put myself like this. Yeah. Okay. So yes. So program semantics is a way to tell you how and when A and B can be said equivalent in such a way that you can replace one with the other. And before delving into the details about differential program semantics and metric semantics, let me give you a quick overview of some of the results the research community have obtained in the past about various forms of program semantics. One example is the notational semantics, in which both the component and the environment, which we here called C, for the context, are interpreted as mathematical entities, as objects in some mathematical framework, in some mathematical word. For example, A can be an element of some term of some functional programming language of type tau, and the context is itself a term of the same programming language, taking terms of type tau and returning terms of type rho. And then their interpretations are A star and C star, which can be composed one inside the other to give you the interpretation of the whole system. So the system obtained by plugging A inside
Ugo,
C.
sorry to interrupt once again. We've had a suggestion. Could you try speaking more quietly? That might.
Okay. Very good.
Thank you.
So this is the notational semantics, and what is good about it is that it is by definition compositional. So the meaning and the interpretation of the whole system is obtained by just composing the meaning of the component A and the meaning of the environment. So very good. Another way of giving semantics to programs is by way of logical relations, and a recipe for logical relation, which is like very well known semantics, is the following one. You can, for example, start from a programming language like the one I was mentioning before, functional programming language with just some ground types and the Aaron construct, and you type terms by way of this type system. And logical relations are just family of relations between programs indexed by types in such a way that functions are double equivalent when they return equivalent programs when fed with the equivalent arguments. This way, you can get a notion of equivalence for programs which satisfy the so-called fundamental theorem, in which you prove that any term is in relation to itself. Actually, this recipe has been applied to various types of typed programming languages, and even in presence of concurrence, even in presence of non-inductive type structures by way of step indexing. And often you can prove that this gives you a fully abstract notion of program equivalence. Actually, this is not at all the end of the story. There are other notions of program equivalence that you can introduce. So for example, you can go by way of co-induction, and with co-induction, you can interpret programs not as a family of relations directly, but by going through Laplace transition systems. So the states of your program become the states of a Laplace transition system. For example, the one you see on the slide is the LTS corresponding to a simple imperative program. And then on top of the Laplace transition system you obtain this way, you can define the usual notion of a bisimulation relation. So for example, two states in this LTS are equivalent, in the bisimulation relation R. Then whenever you make a transition from one of these states following a certain level, you must be able to do the same, also for the other state, N, ending up in two states which are themselves in the relation R. So one relation R satisfying the two axioms you have in front of you is called a bisimulation relation, and the largest such relation is called bisimilarity, and it's your notion of program equivalence. And here the challenge is to prove that bisimilarity is a congruence with logical relations. This is the so-called fundamental lemma. With bisimilarity, if you, for example, work on with a typed programming language, well, it becomes a little bit more complicated. You need to go through something called the house technique, and well, it takes a bit of an effort to do so. This is very successful not only for typed programming language and, let's say, functional programming language, but also in presence of concurrency, as we all know. And it is let's say, the standard, the reference notion of equivalence for things like process algebras. But then I also want to talk a bit about the game semantics, because I will say something about the differential form of game semantics at the end of my talk. So the recipe here is to go by way of games. So you interpret types as games, which are made of sets of sequence of moves, sets of plays. In other words, for example, you can interpret NAT as a set containing the empty sequence, set made of just one question, and then all plays which makes this question be followed by an answer, so by an action. And then when you want to interpret either of the types, you consider all possible ways of interacting with the term of this type. So answering the result, so the answering the pool result of this type, then replying to the, asking the result of this type, and then replying by just true or false, or replying by asking the value of the argument, etc. Then programs are interpreted as strategies, which can be seen as functions returning the next move starting from full history. For example, in the case of the program you find on the slide, you can, which by the way tests for the argument being positive or not. Well, you can just reply to a situation like this one, the one in which you have Q bool, Q nut 3, by just saying that, well, in this case, the result is true. And computation here is seen as really the interaction between a program modeled as a strategy and its environment, which can be seen itself as a possibly non-deterministic strategy, so not really a function, something like more liberal than as a function, which is called the component of the observer. Very good. So this has been applied to various forms of programs, not only the functional ones, but particularly this is quite effective also in presence of program effects, also in presence of concurrent languages, and the symmetry between the program and the environment is particularly useful in certain situations. So this is like a story of successes, all these ways of interpreting programs and to keep notions of program equivalence has been a success. And the question I have is whether this is the end of the story, whether there is still something to be discovered, and the answer is definitely no. And I want to, first of all, before giving you some examples backing my answer, I want to first tell you that some of these notions of program equivalence are well known to be able to be generalized into notion of metrics. So from a notion of program equivalence, so from a relation between expressions in your programming language, you can go to a notion of metrics, so to a function which, given a pair of program expressions in your language, returns, for example, positive real number or infinity. Actually, the notion of the logical relation can be generalized into a metric. This is well known from the work of Reed and Pierce more than 10 years ago. And what you can get is the notion of a metric logical relation, in which you proceed more or less like we have been doing with logical relations, except that now you say that two terms m and n of a functional types are at a distance less or equal to k whenever the application of these two programs to terms which L and P which are at a certain distance, well, is at a distance at most k plus the distance of the two arguments. So this is like, if you like, the most natural way of generalizing logical relations to metrics. This is pretty much natural, and indeed, the fundamental theorem can be extended naturally here, and it comes in this form. The distance between a term and itself is, of course, equal to 0. But there is a price to pay. Actually, this whole thing only works in an affine setting. Actually, you can try to generalize it to something not affine, for example, to something called fuzz, which is the language Reed and Pierce considered. Which is not linear lambda calculus, but rather a lambda calculus with some form of bounded exponential modality. Functions on the reals from which Reed and Pierce starts from need to be not arbitrary functions, but fixed functions. And the whole thing can be seen categorically, observing that the underlying category, namely the one of metric spaces with these maps, does not form a Cartesian closed category, but rather a symmetric moment closed category. So it is very natural that this only works in an affine setting. But then, why are we aiming at metrics? Is there any strong reason to look at metrics rather than equivalences? And actually, yes. And there are many examples of program transformations for which equivalences show all their limitations. For example, you can consider as your program A the signed trigonometric function, and as your program B just the identity. And as you know well, that these two programs have very different interpretations in form of notational semantics, for example. So they are very far from being equivalent in any reasonable sense, but they are even at even distance when you take a look at the metrics. Okay? Even if you compare these two programs by way of metrics, they are at even distance, but they are very similar when the argument, so the real number that you fed A and B with is close to zero. So it is a value which is very close to zero. Not only the two functions have the same value, but where x is equal to zero, but they also have the same derivative. So they behave very similar. And this is actually a very simple, a toy example of what people call approximate program transformations. A program transformation is applied turning a program to another one which does not behave exactly the same, but it behaves just approximately the same with respect to the starting point. And there are further examples, a bit less, let's say, more interesting. For example, this example has been taken from the literature on approximate program transformations. Sometimes you need to perform you need to compute the inverse square root on real numbers, and this is quite expensive in terms of the performance of your program, and you can try to do it by approximating the inverse square root by way of a linear function. And indeed, the two functions are pretty similar, but only when the input is close to a value similar to 0.4, 0.5. Of course, if you want to do it, you need to be sure that the context behave well, okay? That the context feed these two programs with the good value, right? With the value which is close to the one I've just mentioned, 0.5. So, this is an actual program transformation that people in the compiler community actually apply. And there are other further examples. One technique which has been quite popular recently is the so-called loop perforation, in which you get away with a for loop as traditionally conceived, which iterate over its body n times, and you transform it into a for loop which iterates over its body every k, once every k values of the index I. So it skips k minus 1 iterations every time. And again, depending on the body of the for loop, for example, in this case, you just compute the sum of the first i's natural numbers, but depending on the body of the for loop, this could make sense. And there is another example here, which is an apparently quite complicated way of approximating the fast inverse square root function by way of primitive operations on bits, which actually comes from a piece of software that many of us have used in the past, I guess, at least those who with an age similar to mine, and we can discuss about it further. But all this tells you that sometimes, when, for example, you consider approximate program transformation, the meaning of a program is not just its identity, or better, the set of programs which are equivalent to the program under consideration, but the way it relates, how far it is from the other programs. So the difference is the meaning, in other words. And another key concept is that sometimes when you want to apply program transformations, the context matters. While in usual program semantics, the context, the behavior of the context is abstracted away, and everything is needs work for every possible context. Andrea is right. Yes.
Andrea has a comment that it's using.
Yes, absolutely. Andrea is perfectly right. Yeah. Absolutely. This is the algorithm used by Inquake. Yes, for approximating the inverse square root. Yes. Absolutely. So we would like to go towards something as follows. You would like, to have a way to dub two programs A and B to be at a certain distance, and you will also be able to dub the context C as being sensitive to changes according to a certain mathematical entity epsilon. And from these two things, you would like to be able to conclude that feeding C with A and feeding C with B gives you something, a pair of systems which are far away with each other, according to a distance which you can obtain from delta and epsilon by composing delta and epsilon. So this is, for example, what happens in metric logical relations, where, as you where this delta is a real number, actual distance between A and B. This C is taken as a real number itself, but actually it's a zero there. And this is just the sum of the two. And you would like to be able to go beyond that. In particular, you would like to define distances between programs in such a way that the context is taken into account. And this way, to kind of justify the kind of program transformation I've just shown. So, for example, one could take a look at the pair of programs I took as a first example, the sign trigonometric function with the identity. You would like to be able to say that when the context feed the two programs with an argument close to zero, then, well, since the distance between these two functions is itself a function, depending on this epsilon, well, the overall system, the overall systems, the one you obtain by A and B, are not so far from each other because delta applied to epsilon is close to zero.
So I have a question, Ugo, about what you mean by context, because you could have a sign function that's part of some larger program, some graphics library, or some scientific modeling tool, whatever it is. And that's the context that the function is being used in. But you might not be able to tell from that context that, in fact, the sign function is only going to be called for small values of x.
Yeah, indeed. So the context usually is completely abstracted away. Here, I'm saying that you cannot completely abstract away from it. But what matters is about the context is this epsilon. In this particular case, what matters is what the actual argument the context feed A and B with. In some other situations, it could even be something different. For example, you could have a context which feed A and B with the values very close to each other, but then amplifies the result. What you get, what he or she gets in output from A and B. You see what I mean? So I'm just saying that in this particular case, you can take epsilon as just one real number or an interval, if you like. But this is just a very simple example. But in general, the context can do a lot of different nasty things with the whole.
But then that interval, say, would be part of the definition of the context.
It's of course, let's say, part of something that you can extract from the context. That's what I mean. Not maybe part of the definition of the context, but it's part of the semantics of the context.
Okay.
So there is a fundamental tension, however, when you try to do it. you can try to do it by just proceeding as a metric logical relation, namely by saying that as both delta and epsilon are just real numbers. But in this way, you come up with the notion of program distance, which is, as I like to call it, effective, because combining delta and epsilon is very easy. You just sum them. In metric logical relations, is precisely what happens. You just sum the two. Otherwise, on the other hand, you are not expressive because, for example, you cannot justify the program transformation in which A is the sign and B is the identity. Because in this case, delta would be infinite. It would be just the maximal distance. Because of course, for every real number, for every positive real number, there is a value of x for which the identity and the sign are far away, at least this real number. Okay, so it's not so good because it's not expressive, although effective. On the other hand, you can go to the other extreme and get a notion of program distance, which is very expressive, namely it can justify everything, but not at all effective. Why? Because you can take as the distance between two programs just a pair of programs, the pair program itself. So you keep everything, all the information, and from the sensitivity of the context is just the context. Of course, this doesn't make sense. We know that this doesn't make sense. This is not a proper way of giving the semantics because it's not effective. Composing delta and epsilon is the same thing as executing A and B into, say, C in the presence of A or B. So there is a spectrum, a tension between effectiveness and expressiveness. You would like to be able to justify many program transformations, but on the other hand, you want to be effective. A bit like in metrics, or a bit like program equivalences. Of course, in program equivalences, it's kind of an heaven, right? In which you don't even need to put the delta and epsilon together. But you get like a kind of a spectrum in which you have equivalences at the very left-hand side, program pair distances at the right-hand side. Metrics are not so expressive, so very close to relations. There is like a cool gray area that we would like to investigate. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the rest of this talk, in the last 15 minutes. And it's also like the first result I've obtained in an ongoing research project. So let's talk about the differential logical relations, which is like a natural way, I would say, of generalizing logical relations and make them capable of accounting for differences. So the toy language we work with is one with arrow types, product types, and the type of real numbers, because we would like to at least be able to account for simple example I told you about, the one about inverse root, the one about the sine trigonometric function. So let's have real numbers. You get the typing rules, which are very much standard, nothing so surprising about it. And then you have a denotational semantics in terms of sets, which is itself very standard and very natural. So arrows and products are interpreted as the corresponding constructions at the level of sets. So there is nothing surprising about all this. But what comes out as something a little surprising is how to measure, how we measure the distance between two terms. So for each type, there is a notion of the distance, the distance space for this type. So two terms of type real are at a distance itself a real number, usually a positive real number for infinity. But when you try to tap two functions being at a certain distance, you need something different than just a number, because you want to account for the behavior of the context. So that's what you get. You get itself a function, so a distance space, which is itself a function, namely one which takes the value of the input and the error of the input and gives you the error in the output. So in other words, this is kind of a differential between the two functions, right? And you want to keep the whole of this information with you if you want to be expressive. While when you get compare pairs of terms, so terms of type tau times rho, you need to get the distance for tau and the distance for rho. And this way you can define differential logical relations not as metrics, but as ternary relations, in which two terms m and n are tapped at a certain distance measured by r. And of course, the nature of this distance is the one given by your distance space. So for example, two terms m and n of type real are at distance r if the two normal forms of the two terms are far away at the most by r. And of course, the most interesting clause is the one about arrows. So two terms m and n of arrow type are at a distance t, which, remember, it's a function having this shape. Well, this holds if whenever you choose an argument, a closed value of type tau, and you feed m and n with v on the one end, and with w being another value at a certain distance from v, well, you get that this distance between mv and nw is at most the one given by d. Okay? And you feed it, of course, with the semantics of v, because it's the semantics of the input, and the semantics of x. And x needs to be, of course, a bound, an upper bound on the distance between v and tau. So I claim that this is like a generalization, a natural generalization itself to the notion of logical relation and of metric logical relations. And the fundamental lemma that you get out of this is one which tells you that, well, the distance between m and itself is not necessarily zero, but it's an element of the underlying distance space, an arbitrary element of the underlying distance space. And this way you can at least justify the program transformation turning the sine trigonometric function with the identity, because you can put in the middle something like this function, which takes, again, an input and an error, and returns something depending, of course, on the error in the input, but also on the difference between x and sine x. And you can prove that this is the case just by following the definition. And if you consider any pairs of real number r and s at a certain distance epsilon, well, you can just check that the sine of r minus s and sine of s minus r are within the bound, where, of course, f is this function here. This function at the meta level that I put up here. So yes, you can justify the program transformation we were talking about. You can justify it because, of course, this function up here, if you feed it with something close to zero here and with a small enough error here, well, you get out of it something which is small enough. So if you know that the context feed the function with something close to zero, it's fine. You can justify the program transformation. But, you know, are we close to something like a metric? You know, even the way we have formulated the fundamental lemma looks a bit weird, right? Because, you know, we are just saying that the distance between m and itself exists, but shouldn't it be just zero? You know, as in usual metrics. Actually, no, because if you take this identity, well, the metric distance, the distance in metric logical relations between MID and itself is of course 0, but the differential logical relations tell you that the distance between MID and itself, well, it's not the everywhere 0 function. The best you can do is to have a function like this. Because of course, the identity turns an error y into itself. And this is not the same as returning 0 in all possible cases. Okay. So every term, in other words, is put at the distance 0 by way of metric logical relations, but the differential logical relation do not do the same thing. Actually, there is a notion of a self-distance, which is not at all equal to 0. At least in general, it can be different from 0. And this is by itself a way of measuring the sensitivity of the context to changes. And the function induced by delta rho, if you try to turn it into a proper function returning the smallest self-distance, does not satisfy the reflexivity axiom. And so we are not in presence of a. On the other hand, you can keep it the structure of a so-called generalized metric domain. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about it later.
Ugo, can I ask you a quick question? What about the triangle inequality for the metric?
Yes. In the generalized metric domains, something like the triangle inequality actually holds. Actually, you have something slightly weaker. The distance between x and z is at most the distance between x and y plus the distance between y and z plus the self-distance of y. So you can get the triangular inequality, but the price to pay is that you also need to be able to account for the self-distance between the middleman and itself. Okay? Which is quite natural if you think about it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so you can get back ordinary logical relations if you consider hereditarily null distance, so the distance which are 0 at the ground type, and which just turn null distances into null distances at higher types. And you can even get hereditarily finite distances, so finite distances at ground type and hereditarily finite distance at higher types. And what is nice is that you can prove that since the calculus is strongly normalizing, then all terms which are logically equivalent, they are at a distance which is null. Okay? So you can kind of recover logical relations inside the differential logical relations by way of hereditarily null distances. And you also have a second version of the fundamental lemma, which is slightly more satisfactory than the first one. First one was a bit like, if you like, trivial because it was just talking about the existence of one distance. Now the distance is at least finite. Okay, so you can get distance is finite. And in presence of recursion, things work reasonably nice. You can add recursion to the language, and you can get a notion of step index at the differential logical relation. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. Just one thing, you can get again the fundamental lemma in the usual way, parameterized on the underlying step index. Okay, let me skip this and let's go to the notational semantics. I want to spend the last 3-4 minutes, if I can, on the notational semantics and other notion of programs equivalence. So what can we do if we want to turn the notational semantics into something slightly more, let's say, differential, like in differential logical relations. Actually, we can do that. We can replace differential logical relations with metrics. This is something, by the way, some colleagues of me, Paolo Pistone, and Guillaume Geoffroy has done last year. So you can think about metrics in the following form. Maps, which takes the denotation, pair of denotations of element of sigma, and gives you the distance between them. And well, in usual metric semantics, this distance space here is just the set of positive real numbers with a fixed once and for all distance space. However, as we have already said, if you do it, it's fine, but you cannot get a model of the simple type lambda calculus out of it, because metric spaces do not naturally form a Cartesian closed category. If you let the distance space on sigma to depend on sigma, a bit like we did for differential logical relations, the picture changes. For example, you can say that the distance space on functions on the real numbers is this space here, namely the space of functions between, say, compact intervals on the real numbers to positive real numbers. Then, if you have a pair of functions f and g between real numbers, well, the distance between them is itself a function which attributes to any compact interval I the diameter of the union between f and I and g of I. Sorry. So you compute the f of I, g of I, you take the union, and this is like a pretty big set of reals of which you take diameter. And this way you get not a metric space, again, because reflexivity does not hold, but you get something called a partial metric space. So it's not true that the distance between f and itself is 0. On the other hand, you get that you get the symmetry. You get that the triangular inequality holds, and now we can even discount for the self distance in the middle of the middle. Okay, so you can just subtract the self distance between H and itself. And out of the partial metric space, you can always get a proper metric space. This is a well-known fact from the literature on partial metric spaces. So you can also do it, in other words, in the notational semantics, and you get out of it a partial metric space. May I take another 2 minutes or 3 minutes, or is it too late? If it's too late, I can just conclude here. Otherwise, I can take
2 or 3 minutes would be fine. Go ahead.
Okay, very good. So let me talk just about game semantics. I want to tell you something about game semantics. Yeah, here. So also strategies can be kind of used to get a differential form of semantics. So as we know, they can be seen as functions, but they can also be seen as sets of sequences of moves. Okay, and then you can take as the distance between f and g, between two strategies f and g, you can take just their union. We just take their union set theoretically. For example, the distance between these two programs, the one returning x plus 2 and the one returning x plus 3, is a strategy, maybe a set of plays, which up to here is the usual one, but then down here it branches into n plus 2 and n plus 3. And we have studied a lot in the last months what comes out of this idea. Actually, the most surprising thing about all this is that this is perfectly, say, compositional. So you can get a distance between the composition of f and h and g and k by way of the distance between the first two and the distance between the second two, because you can compose non-deterministic strategies, as we all know. The point is that this way you get something very close to a program pair distances, where program pair distance is the one I told you about a few slides ago. So you keep too much of too much information if you do it. So we are currently trying to play with abstract moves. By abstract moves, what I mean is that, you know, here you don't necessarily play on one real number, but you play on an interval of real numbers. This way accounting for you know, the non-determinism in an approximate way. Thank you very much. Sorry if I was a bit late.
That's okay. Thanks very much, Hugo, for a very nice talk. I'm going to unmute everybody, and we can applaud you. So everybody should be able to see now, and we can thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so I'm going to mute everybody again. So we have some time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Yes, Peter, please go ahead, Peter.
Yes, thanks for your presentation. I was wondering exactly on the point on how, to what extent your formalism incorporates non-deterministic programs. Because according to my perspective, non-determinism is the rule and determinism is a special case, which never arises in practice.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Yes, let's say what we can do, at least with differential logical relation, I skipped that, but I can say a few words about it, is that you can endow differential logical relations with effects. And in particular, among the effects you can endow differential logical relations with are non-deterministic effects. So if the non-determinism is kind of internal to your program, you can account for it. And what is interesting is that the difference between two computations exhibiting non-deterministic effects is let's say, a power set on differences. So it's a set of differences. In the general case of say arbitrary monads, because that's the way we interpret usually effects, say the differences between monadic elements, between computations, are themselves monadic elements, but the underlying monad can be different. On the other hand, when non-determinism is there, the two coincide. And the same thing happens, for example, with probabilistic choice. On the other hand, when your effect is, for example, an output effect, it doesn't make too much sense. Think about it. The difference between two programs which exhibit some output effect is not, let's say, the output of some difference. Okay, it's something different. So, yes, I skipped over that.
A good feeling would have been that you can take your functions to become set valued, and on the resulting set take something like a Hausdorff
absolutely
measure.
You're right. Absolutely. That's it. That's precisely
so is that what your abstraction is doing?
Absolutely. Yeah. So
okay.
the distance between two monadic objects, where the monad is the power set monad, is itself a set of differences. So that's what you mean. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. So do we have any more questions for Ugo? So I wanted to ask you, Ugo, about the definition of metric distance for function types, right?
You mean this one?
Formula.
No, maybe earlier. I think it was the one by.
I think we've gone past it now.
Yeah, this one.
That's not the one that I'm meant.
Okay, so then if it's not this one, I'm sure that it's this one.
Yes, this one, right.
Yeah.
So could you unpack this? I mean, this is important. I mean, the third one here, this is an important idea, right? I mean, can you unpack that intuitively? Presumably, I mean, if your theory relies on this having some nice properties, right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. So
does it emerge from some high-level principle or some abstract?
I would claim that this is like a very similar in structure with what you do with ordinary logical relations, except that, of course, you know, the two arguments, V and W, which are usually dubbed to be just equivalent, here they can be at a certain distance. You know? And then, you know, V and W can be at a certain distance, and then you need to kind of evaluate the impact of feeding M and N, the two functions you want to compare, with V and W. And then, you know, the point is this one here, right? What you get here is not just X. Okay, it's not X plus something, like in metric logical relation, but it's T, which is this magic function telling you how far the output is, what's the error in the output, given the error in the input, applied, of course, to X, which comes from this one, and the interpretation of V. The interpretation of V is necessary because, of course, at different points in the input, the distance can be different. Okay? So, you know, in the case of ordinary logical relation, of course, this is 0 and this is 0, right? But here you not only want to take into account the fact that the input can be, the two inputs can be far away from each other, but you also want to take into account that, you know, the M and N can output, can have output which are even very far away, depending on, or very close, depending on the identity of P.
Okay, thanks, Ugo, that's helpful. Sanjeeva, you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you, Ugo. This was a wonderful talk, and you know, long back a student of mine had done some fuzzy transition systems, and this sort of takes it to the logical relation level. But I have a couple of questions, and since you're on slide 16, it's quite appropriate. I also wanted to say that way back when I was doing verification of floating point numbers, we did non-standard analysis. And so we had this idea, if two inputs are arbitrarily close to each other, are the outputs arbitrarily close? That's what a good continuous function was.
Absolutely, yes.
And those were the ones. And so one of the things, you know, going, I guess in one of your later slides you had, you know, those distances being 0 or finite. And so I was just wondering whether this also works out quite nicely for non-standard analysis when you have infinitesimal, when the inputs are infinitesimal distance apart from each other, whether the outputs are an infinitesimal distance. And then going back to your slide 16, I'm a little puzzled about the third thing, which is on the top line, which is tau cross rho is the product. And I'm a little puzzled by this. If you're saying this is the error or the distance between these, I'm a little puzzled. I would have thought it's something to do with the sum or some, you know, one of those, the product of this with that and that, you know, something like the differential rule on products. Why is it the product? I mean, this seems to say that the distance in the reals might actually shrink.
I would say that
I mean, two things could be pretty, you know, could be a bit far apart on tau, and on rho, they could also be, let's say, you know, 0.1 apart and 0.2 apart, but the product would be much closer, 0.02. And that's a little surprising to me.
Yes. So the reason why the distance is the second question first. So the reason why the distance between pairs of elements is a pair of distances is that tau and rho can be very different in structure. For example, imagine the case in which tau is a real number and rho is a very much higher order function. So the only sensible thing to do is to keep the two separate. So in this case, this one will be a real number, and this one will be a very complicated function. So I'm sorry. It's very hard to even think about a way to combine the two.
Okay. So I don't understand. I mean, this is not multiplication. This is
product. So this is not a multiplication.
Excellent. Okay, great. That clears it out for me.
Yeah.
And what about the infinitesimals?
That is a very interesting question. So I at some point with Paolo Pistone, we were thinking about formulating all these in terms of infinitesimal numbers. I think it's a very nice direction. At some point, we dropped it because we couldn't see like a strong benefit for doing that. But if you are pointing to kind of some early research on floating point.
Oh, this was way back 1990. We were doing.
I would be very interested
in floating point numbers in a company which doesn't exist anymore. It's called Odyssey Research Associates. We were verifying floating point programs for the U.S. Air Force and for NASA, and there's a huge market. Believe me, there's a huge market for showing that programs on floating point arithmetic is correct. And
yes. So, what I can say about continuity, let's say, is that from a way to in our framework there is a way to analyze the continuity of function, and this is just the self distance. If the self distance between two programs is a function which is like continuous in the second argument, or better, if the limit of this function when the second argument goes to 0 is 0, then the function is continuous. MID in this case is continuous. So there is a way to do some kind of continuity analysis within the framework. However, this is not done by way of infinitesimal numbers. So infinitesimals are not internalized. But
it would be nice to explore that, because you get away from epsilon delta reasoning to purely algebraic reasoning. And I can also understand why a number and itself need not be a distance 0.
Yeah.
Because you apply the identity to a float, you may not get exactly back the same thing.
That's it. Yeah, for example. And by the way, infinitesimals, for example, are nowadays quite, they are quite useful. They have been shown to be useful in something called automatic differentiation, for example. There are like various formulations of automatic differentiations by way of infinitesimal numbers. And this is another direction we would like to pursue one day or another. Yes, absolutely.
Sounds fascinating. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanjeeva. Glenn, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Yes, thank you. Nice to see you, Ugo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, my question actually was anticipating what you just said. In fact, I mean that surely is some connection with differential categories here. If you go back to your slide 16 and you look at your distance spaces, I mean they have the right kind of, it's of the right kind to be something like differential categories. Where you differentiate a function going from A to B, and you think of it as really going from, then when you differentiate, it's going from A and then differentials over A to
differential over B.
Yeah, that's right.
It's very closely related. We haven't yet found like a tight connection between the two. We cannot claim that what we are doing fits within the realm of differential categories. There are some partial results. There is a paper by Paolo Pistone, a member of our group, which will be out soon on precisely this thing here. But I would say that we have no. On the other hand, there is one tight connection, another one, which is not really on differential categories, but on incremental computing. So when you do incremental computing, you play with exactly the same kind of thing. but the purpose is different because you want to express the increment between programs of functional type, and you do it exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that there are some connections, but we are not able to. We have not been able to find a tight connection yet.
Do you have any kind of preservation results in the second argument, for example, or something like that? You know,
Sorry, a preservation result.
Well, you know, when you have a differentiation, then you take, you know, x and then a differential, and it's linear in the differential part.
Yes, that's it. For example, in one reason why this is like not true here is that we cannot say anything in principle about the way the difference on the input relates with the difference on the output. So everything is kind of driven by this d, and this d can be anything, can be any function. So we are like very, very general, right? That's pretty much what I can say.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for those very nice questions. And so I think we'll leave it there. And if I unmute everybody, we can thank Ugo a final time for his very nice talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ugo.